Now, this morning, the interim financial statements of the government have been reported. I think they're reported every month, but it's for the 7 months ended the 31st of January 2025, and that's the report. I have it in front of me, actually. And that's the report that was referred to in the News Talk News at the top of the hour. Um, Listen, I can't say that it's particularly good or bad, but this is a bit better than it was meant to be. Nevertheless, there are a lot of other things going on at the moment, and we are joined by New Zealand's finest economic and fiscal commentator, Craig Stobo, and he joins us now. Craig, lovely to have you on again. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, listeners. Well, good afternoon.
Afternoon. Yes, it's 19 minutes past 12.
Yeah,
Don't worry, I do that all the time.
yeah,
Hey,
back on schedule.
have you caught up with this, the financial statements being released?
I had a quick look as you were talking about the subject matter. Slightly better than what was hoped for in the forecasts last year. About $1 billion better, a little bit better GST, little bit better expenditure, but some major timing issues there. So I wouldn't read too much into that. The overall debt levels and as a percentage of GDP are still there. They're not going away. So yeah, it's a small improvement on forecasts in 1 month. So I wouldn't put too much store on that.
No. I'm interested, though, that the full year debt is forecast to be 45% of GDP. It's currently 42.8. So I assume we're going to be borrowing more, are we, over the next 5 months?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, exactly. The Crown's had a $12 billion increase in its borrowing program, plus rolling over all the existing maturities. So yeah, those numbers I think were forecast to peak at around 46% of GDP
Yeah.
from Nicola Willis's statement last year. So we're still rising in debt outstanding, and the interest bill, of course, is pretty close to 10 billion, which is much more than we spend on our defence, Michael.
No, although I've just interestingly, we've also heard about the $11 billion that the Reserve Bank managed to lose us before the resignation of Adrian Orr. There's been quite a bit of comment on that, but geez, not an awful lot of sympathy that I've heard from any economic commentators over the last 24 hours. What's your take on it, mate?
Oh, well, surprise resignation, firstly. Secondly, you know, take it at face value around reasons for his resignation, which is what the chair, Neil Quigley, said at the press briefing. It's a matter between the board and Adrian, as you would expect. Now they crack on with
Finding a new one.
the deputy governor in an acting role to the end of March, and then a new governor for 6 months. However that works, they've got to work pretty quickly. In terms of you know why, look, I just don't know why he's resigned. I know Adrian pretty well and haven't spoken to him since yesterday. And if it's personal reasons, then I accept that.
Well, it'd have to be. Well, I mean, the other suggestion is that he didn't enjoy the confidence of the government, and he certainly didn't enjoy the confidence of the Minister of Finance. And those sort of situations would be difficult to carry on, particularly when you're arguing that you need more resources, wouldn't it?
Well, I think the direct relationships with the board. So that'd be my first port of call is discussions with the board and Adrian. And I don't think the public will ever get to know those because they're commercial and private, etc. So yeah, I just don't know.
Okay. You think you're standing for the job yourself?
No, no, I'm fully occupied as chair of the FMA and my other responsibilities. So, governor role back into management. I think there are probably people that are more qualified than I am to do that job, and let's hope they find the right person.
All right. Listen, mate, you wanted to talk also about privatisation and the dock estate. Take me through that.
Yeah, so it's not so much privatisation, it's just helping the public understand choices we have. So we know the coalition agreements in place between National and the two parties entered first in Act do not contemplate asset sales this political term. But it might well be that we should start thinking about this as an election issue, that one or two of them could go to the polls on around asset recycling. So there's $571 billion of state assets Some of those are financial assets, ACC, NZ Super, student loans, but there's quite a lot in the property, plant and equipment area with land, buildings, the dock estate, etc. So Jen Taylor's would be another one, Transpower. And so you ask the question, the important question, who is better to manage these assets? Now, politicians are not business people, and they have other stakeholders other than, for example, customers and shareholders. And arguably there's a tension between being a shareholder and being a regulator. So, for example, you own half of a Jen Taylor. You also regulate the electricity industry via the EA, the Electricity Authority, for example. And you've got a fiscal need for dividends to service, amongst other things, the operating expenditure of the country. And it's my contention that those assets are better off in privately owned, private hands, because the incentive structures for business managers to provide outcomes for consumers are far greater. And you can see that with the telecom changes, for example. Many will not forget the Bakelite telephones on landlines sitting in warehouses that were never used, or the kind of trains that are off the other end of the wharf at Picton, as Richard Prebble used to say. So, I just think there's two angles here. One is recycling those assets to assets we really want, and infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc. And thinking about managing those assets better once they have been recycled. So I think the debate has to start now to get the public thinking about, well, does it really matter who owns those assets? What we really want are great customer outcomes, great services, and more choices. And if that means more competition comes as a result, then great. So how do we start having that conversation? Well, as we mentioned just before, our debt levels are rising as a percentage of GDP. That has to be paid back at some point. You could recycle the assets into debt, or you could recycle the assets into infrastructure that we really want, that's more important to us, and get management of those businesses to focus on running them better as enterprises for the benefit of customers. That's the contention.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Wellington Water and the fiasco there, and you go, well, clearly, the public sector can't run anything, and then ends up being prey to the private sector anyhow, and predated upon. But then I was just thinking of things like, there are also examples of councils, for example, the council in Dunedin, the Port of Otago, which has made tons of money through having really smart, economic, fiscally literate people like Tim Gibson, for example, you'd know, Craig, on their board making smart commercial decisions. Is it always the case that the public sector can't run private enterprise as well? Or trading enterprise as well?
I think the incentives make it really difficult. Other good examples in that area are Port of Tauranga, partly owned by a CCO in Western Bay of Plenty, done a really good job.
They've done a great job.
Growth in the asset, done a great job. So there are lots of examples of that where there is public ownership of an entity, but the entity is run for commercial gain. So I think they're not. They don't. In Port of Tauranga's case, it's partly owned. It's now obviously listed on the exchange, but that's given them access to capital that the Crown doesn't have. And I think that's the other thing to think about in this debate is, for example, if Transpower wants to upgrade the network, right, where does it get its cash from? It can only get it from the government.
Yeah.
The government says, I can't afford it, and all of us suffer because the grid is not working with the power lines companies and the electricity producers to get power to where it's needed. So we all suffer. So there's nothing wrong with private capital helping us develop public sector assets at all, because they can do it faster and cheaper than the public can. The public just can't afford.
So what would you do? In a case like that, would you go, I'll sell my shareholding in Meridian and Mercury, I think the government owned 51% in both of those, and then utilise it to upgrade Transpower? Or do you go, no,
exactly.
Or do you go, I'll let the private sector come and buy half of Transpower?
Well, either of those options. I mean, the key metric for me is that when you look at instant dividends from public sector entities, it doesn't cover the interest bill that is used to finance them. So that we're going backwards in a commercial sense. It just doesn't make sense. So you've either got to get out of them or lift their operating performance, which goes to charges and other things, which is difficult to stomach because the public doesn't like having their publicly owned entities raising prices when they think they own them or partially own them. So, I think the choices are, recycle the capital from entities that have got access to private markets like Meridian, like Mercury, recycle that government ownership into Transpower, upgrade the network that's required, and to give us more security over the supply of the power through the spine of the nation.